you can actually make hyperlinks in the index so that you can find the page in the book. Click on it, you get to page 43. Well, that's fine unless it happens to be a 4-volume work, because the link will only take you to the page within the book that the index appears in, and the other 3 volumes are left out. So it's absolutely meaningless. If you click on Samuel Johnson, he isn't mentioned in the Q to Z section of the book, etc., etc. So, brilliant idea, but actually execution needs to understand a little more than I think they do. Then one of the issues I think for me then is the question of, which Dan brought up, concerns me a lot, and I think this is where, as scholars, we ought to be putting enormous pressure on, is the question of quality in Google Books. How do you judge quality? Now, one of the ways in which people often like naively to judge quality is somehow to have faith in those old books. Those old books are really good books. And this is what got me into this problem in the first place, is that's a faith within Project Gutenberg, which said, we will now load all these old books up onto the net. Well, what you is the 19th century, in particular the late 19th century, is the home of some of the most atrocious publishing that ever happened. And those books, oddly, have been put out of the reach of most innocent readers. If you're a scholar and you want to look at bad editions of Tristram Shandy, you can go and find them. But they're not the first copy that you will put your hand on. Now, why aren't they the first copy? Well, most libraries, in fact, have, through a winnowing system, moved them off into distant repositories. And you have to go down into dungeons or drive down roads or fly across the state to find those books. And that was actually a quality assessment process that was enormously powerful. And with good publishing and good editing and better scholarship, we actually ended up in a position where the books on the shelves probably, one way or another you could say, were reasonably the best quality. Now Google has gone in and they have sucked back out of those repositories, because those are the very first places they went. They didn't go to the shelves to which we all have access. Library said, no, go down the road. Start down there with all the junk we've got. So the very first stuff that came out onto the net through Google was actually some of the very worst editions. And I've been making a point about Tristram Shandy for about 4 years, and each time I go back and look, it's even worse on Google Books. But what are up on the front? The first dozen books are incomprehensible to anybody who understood anything about that book, apart from the fact that you land in volume 3 of one edition and you're like, can't expect volume 2 of edition that was published 100 years later, etc., etc. So what we've done in a way with this great step forward is pushed us back into the past. And we're partly because of the effects of copyright laws, but also a certain naivety about where they should go. And you say this to Dan Clancy, he says, oh, well, that's where the librarians, so the librarians' fault, Google should think nothing about it. So then finally, and I've gone on far too long, but let me just say a couple of points on why is it difficult to criticize this project. Well, one thing is it's great. It's absolutely wonderful, and I hate to be without it. And one of the very worrying things about the settlement under the Department of Justice guidelines is it wants to push us back to snippet view for an awful lot of books. But anyone knows how awful snippet view is in Google Books, the thought that all modern books will go back to that is disastrous. And though I don't necessarily support the settlement, that's one reason we should think about it. So it's free. Now, I have this problem also when I criticize Project Gutenberg. Here are all these people giving in this voluntary labor. How can you come along and criticize? It's a little like going to the high school bake sale and saying that doesn't really look like it came from Shade and East. But that surely isn't the issue so simply. I don't think we can pass it up just because we're getting it for free. There's an awful lot of money and there's an awful lot of library resources that have gone into this, and there are an awful lot, in that dreadful economic phrase, of opportunity costs that have been turned down to do this and will never open again. So free isn't good enough for me to let them off the hook. I think one of the things that makes it difficult is Google has a remarkable chameleon character. When they want to call it a library, as Sergey Brin did when in the New York Times article he wrote, they call it a library. And when you say this doesn't work to me or look to me like a library, they say, oh, it's not a library, you can't call us a library. Sometimes they've got to come out and say, what they are they a research tool or are they for the general reader? If you say it's a research tool, people will say, no, it's just for the general reader. You can't hold it to those fastidious standards. If you say it's for the general reader, you get these very strange things, like you say, well, look, I've got volume 1 here, and I can't find volume 2 of the same book. And the librarian said to me, because he didn't like this, he said, people don't read that way, in a tone of outrage. Well, it seems to me going from volume 1 to volume 2 is not a bad thing to do. The other thing that people will argue is, look, it's just going to get better. Maybe, maybe not. As I say, I've been following one particular book that they know I'm very critical of, and I've talked to some of them about it, and it hasn't got any better. It's probably got worse if you look at the way it deals with Christianity over time. But the other thing is that we can't simply allow that inevitability, that technologically determined future to tell it. If it's going to get better, we've got to complain. We've got to shout and say what's wrong with it, and why should scholarly libraries have been cooperating in something that doesn't look at the least scholarly. If they want to go to the public library, go to the public library. The other thing is, of course, that if you criticize things like this, you start to look like a Luddite. And that, I think, is one of the most difficult things of dealing with librarians. As I said, Jeffrey Nunberg, at a stroke, he pointed out 200,000 errors in the cataloging. And he was thanked by Google. Librarians went up the wall. And one of the things they did, and one of the things that I think disturbed me most of all, and Dan mentioned this, well, libraries do things worse. And you will find senior librarians standing up there whenever you criticize Google metadata, they say, oh, we make a terrible mess of metadata. We're awful. Well, one thing is they don't list 200,000 books as dated for 1899 at the stroke of the keyboard. That isn't even in the capability of libraries. They don't have systematic problems. They're difficult because they have random problems. They don't have the same problems. If you say Google gets volume sets wrong, they will say, oh, we get volume sets wrong. The two problems are entirely different. Libraries don't tend to get 4 volume works published at the same time wrong. They get multi-volume works published over 70 years wrong, and who can blame them? But that isn't the same problem. But librarians, I think, and this is what worries me, if you talk to senior librarians, the ones who sort of will talk about me as ranting about Google, they will spend a great deal of their time to redeem Google by trashing their staff. By basically saying all the people we employ are incompetent, so therefore why should we worry about Google being bad? Now, I actually think that's a deeply, deeply disturbing thing. It's even more disturbing in some ways because when we suddenly said, well look, Google is really bad, they said, oh, we've got a solution now. We're coming up with the Hathi Trust. The Hathi Trust, organized by libraries, is going to redeem all the errors that Google has made and all the failure that library had in the first place for setting any standards of quality on Google. And what do you read about the Hathi Trust? That the Hathi Trust is no worry, pain-free solution to archiving vast amounts of digital content. You can rely on the expertise of librarians and information technologists. So on the one hand, they want to trash their staff and say they're absolutely incompetent and incapable of writing good metadata, so why not let Google do it? But when Google seems to be in a problem, they say, no, no, we're so expert and so brilliant, we'll come along and save the day. Well, you can't have it both ways. Either you're incompetent, or you're brilliant, or there's somewhere in the middle and maybe see to work on that. And so finally, very finally, and I've gone on far too long, my apologies, to historians. Well, so historians are generally, not all, but some have said, you know, it's a scholarly small-mindedness besides them. Bibliographical fastidiousness, I've been accused of more than once by the same person. I actually like that one. My dear old mother in a long day, but noticing her sloppy, completely careless son. To have him called fastidious, I think would have made her life worthwhile. I'm sorry to say it. But bibliographical, to ask that Volume 2 follows Volume 1, or that you should be able to find whether Madame Bovary was written by Henry James or not, is called bibliographic fastidiousness. God help us all. Of course, the idea is you just don't get it. The assumption that you don't use it, that you're locked in the past, or introducing nuance into the debate, as I was once accused of. Or indeed that you're feeding and pandering to special interests. Well, none of that holds up to me. Yeah, Google Books is great. Yes, it's good for history. But equally, if historians don't start putting pressure, not necessarily on Google, but on their libraries, to think a little more seriously about what the digital collections of the future should look like, and turning them not simply into a bunch of digitized books, but into a